Cable television, are you ready? Cable television.
We're ready.
Excellent. You still don't sound like Vanessa. I will start this hearing. Calling to order this hearing. This is a hearing of the Committee of the Whole of the Council of the District of Columbia. I'm Phil Mendelson, Chairman of the Council and Chair of the Committee of the Whole. Today is Friday, October 21st, 2022. The time is 3:45 in the afternoon. This hearing is on Bill 24-707, entitled the Containing Litter and Ensuring Adequate Neighborhood Collections Amendment Act of 2022. Containing litter and ensuring adequate neighborhood collections spells out, the first letter spells out Clean Collections Amendment Act of 2022. This legislation was introduced. All right. This legislation was introduced on March 10th of this year by Councilmember Janice Lewis George. And I'm not quite sure why the memo said it was co-sponsored by other folks. Because it actually was co-introduced by like 7 council members altogether. The stated purpose of Bill 24-707 is to amend the Sustainable Solid Waste Management Amendment Act of 2014 to require private solid waste collectors who provide services to multifamily residential properties to supply properties with solid waste containers that can store the equivalent of 32 gallons of solid waste per residential unit, and to require collections services at least twice a week at these properties. Violations of the act would result in a civil penalty of no less than $500 against a private solid waste collector. Regulation of how private businesses, in this case solid waste collectors, provide services is largely within the jurisdiction of the Department of Consumer and Regulatory Affairs. I think I'll leave it at that. The record in this matter will be open for 2 weeks. That is, it will close at 5 p.m. on Friday, November 4th, 2022. The hearing notice indicated that this hearing would start at 2:30 or immediately following the preceding hearing, and our previous hearing ended at about 2:30. Excuse me, 3:30. So that's why we're starting so late. I see Councilmember Lewis George here. If you have an opening statement, please.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses for taking time to speak with us today. I introduced Bill 24-707, the Containing Litter and Ensuring Adequate Neighborhood Collections Amendment Act, or Clean Collections Amendment Act of 2022, in March of this year with the support of 6 of my colleagues, Councilmembers Brianna Doe, Charles Allen, Trayon White, Robert White, Brooke Pinto, and Anita Bonds. I drafted this bill after hearing from Warford constituents, particularly in the Brightwood community, that apartment buildings in the area often lack adequate trash and recycling collections, or the amount in which trash was being picked up was inadequate. Amidst the pandemic, with more people staying home, we saw an enormous increase in the amount of trash and recycling produced at home. To put it short, the Rats were having a field day and are currently still having a field day as a result. My team dug into the problem, and together we discovered that the current law just says a private collection property owner shall provide adequate waste collection service. That's it, with no definition for what that means in actual practice. DC regulations do go into more detail, specifying that property owners must provide separate containers for trash and recycling as well. But again, I quote, the regulation just says a sufficient number of containers. So with words like adequate and sufficient, there really is no clear guidelines around a very huge issue in our city. And private collection haulers right now must provide service at least twice a week. is all that we know. This bill seeks to add specificity, to add in the enforcement of our existing laws and regulations, so that we can have clear enforcement and also clear regulations for everyone. I'm not trying to add significant requirements or increase the size of containers beyond what is already reasonable. But I do believe we have a significant rodent problem in the district, and this bill helps get at one of the roots of that problem, which is inadequate solid waste containers in multifamily and commercial properties across the district. We've also seen increasing reports of dumping and misuse of public litter containers. There are also which is also a potential symptom of inadequate private solid waste collections, meaning when people who live in multi-unit units see that their trash is built up, they are going to our neighborhood trash cans, which we consider our public litter containers, and further dumping trash there. And so today I'll be asking questions of our witnesses focused on our existing practices and how this law could be used to improve our enforcement efforts. For example, how well are we currently checking to make sure private collection properties provide adequately sized solid waste containers? What do we consider to be adequately sized solid waste containers? How well are we currently checking to make sure private collection haulers provide twice a week service? Where are we with source separation plans? And how many of our residential buildings currently don't have adequate solid waste collection now? I've also have several follow-up questions related to pre-hearing questions we submitted in partnership with the Committee of the Whole. I'm grateful for today's hearing, and thank you, Chairman, for affording us the opportunity to discuss ways to improve enforcement. This is a multi-agency effort that crosses between Department of Buildings, inspectors, the DPW Suite Team, and DPW's Office of Waste Diversion. So I look forward to hearing from them. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember. So I'm going to call the witnesses in. Patience Singleton, who is the Chair of Advisory Neighborhood Commission 4A. Eric Jones, who's Vice President of Government Affairs for the Apartment and Office Building Association of Metropolitan Washington. Nathan Harrington, who's with the Ward 8 Woods Conservancy. Reginald Black, who registered as a witness, saying he's a candidate for ANC. Kim Patterson, who's Vice President of the Brightwood Community Association. And Charlotte Dreisen. If those supposed to be let in. I did not disappear. I just sneezed and blew my nose, and I didn't want you all to see it. I don't believe Patience Singleton, Commissioner Singleton, is here. She was here earlier. And I don't see Eric Jones. But I think I saw Nathan Harrington. Or I saw a box with his name. Now I see him. You're up.
Yes. Hi, everybody. Thanks. Greetings, council members and friends. Thanks for making the time. And I want to thank council member Janice Lewis George for taking on this really important issue. My name is Nathan Harrington. I'm founder of the Ward 8 Woods Conservancy. Our mission is increase the health and beauty and public enjoyment of the more than 400 acres of public land here in Ward 8. And that work puts us kind of at the front lines of trash. In the 4 years since we started, we've removed over 1 million pounds of trash from woods, streets, streams in Ward 8. And what I can tell you is that a substantial portion of that trash is originating at apartment complexes that have issues with waste disposal. We see dumpsters that are overflowing, trash bins that are overflowing. And in addition to the trash attracting animals and being spread around by wind, it has this compounding effect of causing residents to become desperate, like, what am I going to do with this stuff? And is it going to be next to the dumpster where I park my car? And that's one of the contributing factors to situations where residents actually throw their trash over a fence or across the street into a wooded land that is publicly owned. It creates this impression that nobody cares. It creates a sense of apathy that it really doesn't matter where you put your trash because it's going to be laying around anyway. And maybe it's better to at least put it a little bit further from my front door or my car, even if that means throwing it in the woods. So there is a definite need for this legislation. But I do, based on what I've seen, I have a few recommendations on how I think it could be made stronger to ensure that it meets the intended objectives. As was mentioned, the law that we're amending here, the 2004 law, requires that the managers provide separate receptacles for trash and recycling. So I want to make sure that this amendment aligns with that, and I would suggest setting a minimum requirement for trash and for recycling, and I would suggest 32 gallons for each. By comparison, single-family homes that are served by private trash collection, they usually are emptied once a week and they get 96 gallons. So that's 3 times what is in the current draft. This current draft would also, of course, require that they be emptied twice a week. So they don't need to be twice as big, but I do think that we should specify a minimum for trash and recycling so that we don't inadvertently encourage people to see it as all one and the same. Another thing that we see a lot are that residents will have bulk items like mattresses and sofas that do not fit in the dumpster. So when the dumpster gets emptied, those items will be left next to or leaning against the dumpster, and they may sit there for months because it's not included in the contract between the property manager and the waste hauling company. I would recommend an amendment that specifies that these waste hauling contracts need to include that. Because residents in these apartment complexes do not have the option of calling 311 to have those things picked up the way residents of single family homes do. Of course, we know that this law will only be as impactful as the enforcement. And I think it's important that we specify which agency and which staff within that agency are responsible for enforcing this. I don't think that we should rely on residents to submit 311 requests as a means of identifying problems, because a lot of agency staff have told me is that, well, we don't issue fines in Ward 8 because we don't get 311 requests from Ward 8. It's pretty well documented that wealthier residents, those who with more social and political capital, are more likely to submit those requests, and so it compounds and reinforces existing inequalities when you don't have any proactive enforcement. So I think that the apartment managers should be required to submit a copy of their waste hauling contract to DCRA or DPW, whichever agency we decide is going to be responsible for this. And that way the inspectors can just check what is the capacity of the dumpsters, what's the frequency, does it include bulk items? And if not, they can issue the fine, and that should be tied into all of the renewal of certificate of occupancy and business license and so on that these properties need to have anyway. And then there needs to be a frequency of inspection to make sure that what's happening on the ground actually aligns with what's in the contract. That should be done at least once a year. And then if a problem is discovered, the law as written says that there's a $500 fine if it happens twice within a 6-month period. They need to come back to see if the problem has been corrected to determine whether the fine is applicable or not. And even after the fine is applicable, they need to inspect monthly to make sure that the problem has been corrected. Because what I've seen I've submitted many 311 requests for sanitation enforcement in situations like this, where there's a dumpster and it's overflowing and there's trash all over the place. Sometimes inspectors from DPW sweep will come, and actually I'll get a note through the 311 system saying a fine has been issued, but I'll go back a week or two later and the situation is still not corrected. I don't know if the fines are being paid or not, but it's not actually, the landlords are not actually cleaning up their act. So I'm over time. I just want to reiterate that we strongly support this law. It's really, really necessary. And I want to thank Councilmember Louis George and Nato, Alan, Trayon White,
You are
Robert
over
White,
time, so
Pinto, and Bonds for introducing it.
thank you. And Mr. Harrington, I'm at a little bit of disadvantage because I don't have a copy of your statement.
Oh, I'll submit it momentarily.
Thank you. Reginald Black?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. Good afternoon, Chairman Mendelson, members of the committee. My name is Reginald Black, and I'm a candidate for Advisory Neighborhood Commission 4EO1. And we definitely feel that the Clean Act is something that is very much needed. And it is tied to some instances in the Brightwood neighborhood in which the sweeps team has been the DC government participant removing trash cans, which leads to what we would consider a rat plague and increases in that. And over the last few months, DPW sweeps team has been removing the public trash cans, citing that there's been abusive and illegal use of public trash cans by residents in commercial and apartment buildings, and neighbors feel that the removal of public trash cans for any reason is a public health hazard. These neighbors also indicate that the removal of public trash cans results in an invasion of rats and other disease-ridden wildlife. We are emerging from the trauma of COVID-19 and must take caution to avoid a public policy that creates further plagues, viruses, and pandemics. We want to see that if there is any future trash can removal, the public trash cans, that those particular instances first come to the advisory neighborhood commissioners and the commissions that will be affected, and that there is a robust public process as to the findings of the sweeps team and clear reasoning presented to the commission about whether they feel the trash can needs to be removed, and allow the advisory neighborhood commissioners and said commission to vote and decide whether a public trash can should be removed or not. We've seen this all across 13th Street in Brightwood, and neighbors are very concerned about this because we know that without the trash cans, then the folks who are walking their dogs cannot dispose of their waste. People walking the street coming from the store and all these things cannot dispose of their waste. Traditionally, these are issues that the neighbors should really be talking about and really should have a decision on. And we support being able to keep our public trash cans while making sure that our larger buildings and larger commercial areas have adequate trash so that sweeps isn't coming around and just deeming the public can use as illegal when people just don't have enough space to throw away and recycle their items. And the ANC should be an integral part of that in making a decision whether a public trash can should be removed. This is something that I've heard from my neighbors constantly. They are always asking about what to do about the rats and how we can assist them. And I think DC Health also needs to be a big part of this in doing proactive assessments on the population of disease-ridden wildlife and their predators that may be in the area, such as coyotes and buzzards and eagles. So we want to make sure that all of our neighbors are safe, that they're able to remove waste effectively, and they should be able to decide if in fact a public litter container should stay in the neighborhood or it should be removed. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Black. Kim Patterson. Kim Patterson, if you're speaking, I
Yes.
can't hear you.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yes, I can. I can see you as well.
Excellent. Thank you for having me. I want to thank Council Member Janice Lewis George for inviting me to testify. I'm Kim Patterson. I'm the Vice President of the Brightwood Community Association. And we have dealt with Many apartment buildings located on the 14th Street corridor between Military Road and Aspen Street. This is my third term as VP, and for at least 6 years, we have worked with the Department of Health on rat control and fining the owners of the apartment buildings for negligent trash disposal and containment. The Department of Health has conducted numerous walkthroughs through the Brightwood area, mainly on the 14th Street apartment side. And they have cited and fined many of the apartment buildings for having inadequate size trash cans. They actually have trash cans the same size as the private homeowners. And obviously that is not the right size for an apartment building. So the trash cans are constantly overflowing. They are not removed and emptied on a continuous cycle. Sometimes they go by a couple of days, maybe a week, maybe longer than a week, and they're not properly emptied. So the Clean Act would definitely help us when we are trying to enforce the apartment building owners to have a consistent schedule of trash removal and adequate sized trash cans. So we definitely need this bill to be passed because it is a nuisance in our neighborhood. The overflowing trash cans create a problem with rats. And we have many rat burrows that have been documented by the Department of Health, over 300 on the 14th Street corridor with the apartment buildings that have been treated. And they help temporarily. The poison does help temporarily, but the rats keep coming back because they have an open source of food, which is the garbage coming from the overflowing dumpsters. And the rats multiply and they go into the neighbors that are private homeowners. Their backyards have rats. There's rat burrows throughout the neighborhood. The apartment building owners have been fined because of improper trash disposal, but the fines are minute. They are just a cost of doing business. They are not $10,000 or $5,000. They're under $1,500. It's a cost of doing business. So the owners of the properties don't do anything to resolve the issue. So we do support the Clean Act. One, because we want to see dumpsters that are properly sized for the building to contain the trash of the many residents. We also support the Clean Act because we want to see the owners of the buildings, the apartment buildings, conduct proper rat and rodent extermination on a continual basis. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Patterson. Charlotte Drezen, or yes, Drezen or Dreisen?
Thank you. It's Dreisen. Much appreciated. My name is Charlotte Dreisen. I'm really excited to be here today. And first and foremost, thank you, Councilmember Lewis George, for introducing this legislation. I think the tweak that Nathan, you had offered earlier of having that dedicated amount of volume for recycling, if implemented with that tweak, I think this would be the single biggest piece of legislation passed in the district that would help support the circular economy, which is no small feat. So I really appreciate you recognizing the importance of multifamily recycling. I am no longer with the district government, but I supported multifamily recycling programming with the Office of Waste Diversion and Department of Public Works for a few years, and I'm delighted to now support plastic manufacturers, prevent waste from entering the environment, and offer a few thoughts here. I'd love to underscore that multifamily residents create more waste than single family, yet we spend a lot of our time in DC thinking about services to single family residents, which are important. But of course, we know our population growth is going to be in the multifamily sector, which is why it's so critical we have really strong recycling habits and regulations and laws for that demographic in particular. As you pointed out, Councilmember Lewis, we have a slew of multifamily recycling requirements in the DCMR today. They are unfortunately not enforced as robustly as we would like, and awareness of them is really low. I can tell you that I've talked to hundreds of multifamily buildings in DC. Many of them are unaware that they have that twice a week requirement, and they don't really understand what that adequate, exactly as you pointed out, vague, amount of volume would look like. So really appreciate you offering a number of gallons that would be a minimum requirement. Again, seconding the comment Nathan offered, that what's really critical for us to make a difference between the status quo is to have a minimum amount for recycling alone. It's very rare, it does happen, but it's rare that a building doesn't have enough total volume to manage trash and recycling. They just don't have enough recycling, really kind of what it comes down to at the end of the day. In fact, our multifamily recycling rate today is only 13% compared to the single family recycling rate, which is 25%. Not only do we recycle about half of what we do in the single family space, but the multifamily recycling we collect is more than twice as contaminated. So we know that we have a problem with quantity as well as a really big problem with quality. I would offer that not only is this legislation really important, I think, to set that precedent of what that minimum collection needs to look like for multifamily recycling, but I would really encourage council to treat this as a jumping off point to better enforce and amplify the other recycling requirements we have for multifamily today. Multifamily buildings are required to educate residents upon move-in and once a year about how their recycling programs work. Very few do that today. They're required to have signage showing what's not recyclable and what is recyclable. Very few do that today. Bins need to be labeled. Very few are labeled sufficiently. So there's really a constellation of requirements that I think we need to be thinking about. This is the most important one. I think you hit on the big one, but I do think we need to start thinking about what comes next. As we heard about in the most recent hearing right prior, New York City is a great example of this. Not only does New York City require multifamily recycling, but they require multifamily buildings of a certain size to have textile recycling, to have electronics recycling. There are cities that are considering plastic film recycling on site, since we know we can't recycle that curbside with everything else. So I would love to suggest that moving forwards, not only would I offer my fully pledged hearted support of this piece of legislation with that tweak for a minimum volume for recycling, but to really think through what other materials can we help the multifamily recycling space collect. And I think, Nathan, you also offered a really important piece, which is the bulk waste piece. Since unfortunately today, if you're a multifamily resident in DC, you have next to no access to recycle bulk or dispose of it safely. It is very hard to get to a transfer station if you are not a vehicle owner, and it is highly unsafe without a sidewalk to walk into the facility from public transit. I know I'm over time, so with that, I would really just love to extend my thanks and appreciate the opportunity to offer some comments.
Thank you, Ms. Dreisen. I'm at a disadvantage. I don't have a copy of your statement. Mr. Harrington got me his.
I would be delighted to submit it. I might not have it in the next few minutes, but I will be sure to follow up with it.
All right, that would be helpful. Thank you. And you used to work for the department?
I did.
So you have some familiarity with these issues.
I have been really appreciative of the chance to be in the weeds and with inspectors in the field and property owners and managers that are working to make it work.
When did you leave the agency?
November 2021, about a year ago.
Yeah. I have a question for Ms. Patterson. Ms. Patterson? I don't see Ms. Patterson. Dropped off. Then I can't ask her a question. I don't know if anybody else would know. If they do, she had testified that property owners are happy to pay small fines of $1,500 or less as a cost of doing business. My question is, do they actually pay the fines? Does anybody know?
I don't, like I said, I sometimes I get notifications through the 311 system saying that fines have been levied, but whether or not they're paid isn't something that the person who submits the request is ever informed of. What I know is from going back and visiting some of those sites that the conditions that led to the fine are not remedied. And so that's why I suggested that instead of maybe in addition to fines, they could be compliance with these laws could be tied into renewal of the various licenses that they need in order to operate, and to also to accept many of the worst offenders in Ward 8 are complexes that rent primarily to Section 8 voucher holders. So the bulk of their rent money is actually coming from the taxpayer. These are publicly subsidized buildings, and yet they are skimping, trying to save money. Maybe they're so mismanaged that they don't think they have the money to provide proper sanitation. And then it becomes a problem for everybody else in the neighborhood.
If they're fined, but they don't pay the fine, then they would come under Clean Hands Act. The Clean Hands
Yeah,
Law.
you would think so.
I do not have any other questions. Councilor Lewis George?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you to all the witnesses. Nathan, I wanted to start with you. Thank you for your testimony in the work in Ward 8. And I appreciate the recommendation to also name a minimum for recycling and trash separately. One, do you pick up a lot of recyclable materials too? And what do you think that ratio of the amount should be for the amount of recycling? And I will come, I know Charlotte will have answers, so I'm going to ask her that too, but wanted to hear from your perspective.
Probably the majority of what we collect is recyclable. But as Charlotte mentioned, the recycling rate is low overall, and especially for these multifamily buildings. So recyclables and non-recyclables are spilling out of the bins and being thrown every which way, I would say in equal measure. Single family homes, as I said, receive in most cases a 96-gallon trash bin and a 96-gallon recycling bin. There are exceptions in like I think in Georgetown and parts of Capitol Hill where the alleys are really narrow, they get smaller bins and twice a week collection. But they're generally, I think in both cases, the recycling bin capacity is equal to that of the trash bin capacity. It's a 1-to-1. And I don't see a reason why the requirement here should be different.
Yeah. And then what, you had some ideas I thought I really like the idea of building owners actually registering the size of their containers with the agency so that they know if they're in compliance. What else would proactive management and enforcement of this look like?
Yeah, so the 2014 Solid Waste Act that we're trying to amend here requires that the waste haulers submit a report to DPW of the amount of trash that they hauled, where it came from, where they took it, and so on. I guess I would suggest that the apartment managers be also required to submit a copy of those contracts. They're required to have them, but I actually asked some of the DPW inspectors if they could verify that these properties had contracts and that the contracts were in compliance with the law, and they basically said we don't have that information because they're not required to submit it.
Okay. And at a lot of the buildings, do you see sort of another marked place for recyclable, or most of it is always just together, trash and recycling together? Do you see any instances of separate of them being separated? And then what else do you attribute some of the excess trash coming from some of the apartment buildings?
I think when you sort of trash everywhere and generally unsanitary conditions, just once they exist, they tend to fester and get worse. Residents are more likely to litter or be sloppy with where they put their trash if they see that the property is already a mess. And so the management and their waste haulers, you could say, are setting a bad example by allowing trash to go every which way. And then they don't have any real authority or standing when they try to go to the residents and say, hey, you need to stop throwing your bags of trash off of your balcony and over this fence into the woods, because then the residents are going to say, well, I tried to put it in the dumpster, but the dumpster was overflowing and, you know, the raccoons got into it. So I'm not going to put it next to the dumpster. I'm going to put it in the woods over there.
Right.
You know, we have tried sort of building by building we've identified problem spots, and we go to the management and we say, have you noticed that this is happening? And most of them just ignore us. They blow us off. They don't want to talk to us. They don't want to deal with it. The only way to really force them to make right is if there's some enforcement. As has been said, the enforcement has been inconsistent.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. Charlotte, I want to come to you, and then Reginald, I'll be to you next. First of all, thank you so much for your testimony and your work on this issue. I appreciate your recommendation to have a minimum recycling capacity per unit too. Do you have any recommendations for what that minimum size should be?
Absolutely. It's a really good question. And I think that, Nathan, you really hit the nail on the head, that using kind of that 50 to think about, whatever you have for trash, you should have for recycling is a minimum. By weight, multifamily buildings generate slightly more recyclables than trash. And we know that recycling takes up a lot more space. So if you were to have 50-50 size of containers, dumpsters, or bins for trash and recycling, that should be a pretty bare minimum of the amount of recycling space you need. If we were to hit our 80% diversion goal, you would need to have a good amount more recycling containers than trash. But I think that, we're only diverting 13% of multifamily waste right now, maybe 1 in 5 pounds of recyclables. So certainly I think we're a little bit a ways from needing, that perfect world ideal amount of recyclables. So I think that's a really logical ratio to use. And I would also add an asterisk that for, we have an increasingly, large amount of really high volume multifamily building stock. Certainly we have a lot of alleys in our community. Not every city does, but for the biggest multifamily buildings, I would suggest that, in the DCMR today, someone can write into DPW and request an exception to having 2 bins to have, twice a week pickup of recycling to have 1, for example. I think it would be reasonable to offer that if a very large building needs to have, maybe 7-day-a-week pickup, but not quite that same 32-gallon per unit ratio, that they would be able to, meet the spirit of the legislation within, a loading dock size constraint. So that might be something worth considering. I think it's going to be the exception rather than the rule that it's needed. But I do think that for a building of 800 people in Noma, 1,000 people, somewhere, it might be critical for those off cases.
Great. I appreciate that suggestion. And then can you say a little bit more about the statistics around the volume of trash and the recycling produced in multi-family properties and what you've seen here and what you've witnessed here in DC?
Yeah, absolutely. I want to say that 52%, if my memory serves, percent of multifamily waste is recyclable, curbside recyclable. So we know that, of course, you could recycle funky things separately through drop-offs beyond that. But the Office of Waste Diversion's Zero Waste Guide for Multifamily and their 2021 desktop waste characterization study dives into all of the numbers you might want to your heart's content. But the few that I think are important is that they generate more recyclables than trash, just over 50%. They divert 13% of their waste versus 25 for single family. So, just about half as much recycling. And then their contamination rate is 27%, which is very high. And a big part of that contamination is recyclables in plastic bags, for context, which is prohibited in single family recycling, but is currently allowed in multifamily and is one of the big inequitable pieces, in my opinion, about between single family and multifamily today. So when we think about that quality piece for multifamily recycling, that's the big one that we are worried about.
Okay. Thank you. I appreciate that. And Reginald, thank you for referencing the issue of unannounced public litter container removals. That's the focus of another one of my legislations and something we hope to tackle in a hearing on later on this year. But wanted to ask you sort of about your experience with the rats and rodent infestations that are happening in Brightwood and any patterns you're seeing.
So where I am for EO1 is nestled within 2 commercial corridors, one a little smaller, the other, which is a major thoroughfare, Georgia Avenue. And so just the level of traffic and activity that happens in these corridors creates an overage of waste. And then that brings the rats. And because of the sheer nature of not being able to dispose of waste properly and adequately and frequently, those rats are allowed to breed. They are allowed to grow in size. I've talked to neighbors who have shown me pictures of almost cat-sized like rats. And it's also bringing other forms of wildlife that may carry rabies, such as possums and raccoons. They're all looking for food. And that also then brings predatory wildlife to the neighborhood in the forms of coyotes and foxes and snakes and eagles, and even buzzards. I just talked to one of my constituents yesterday, talking about how a flock of buzzards were consuming a deceased rat in the street, and it blocked traffic. So, we need to be able to have adequate waste management. The other point is DPW sweeps teams should not be removing public litter cans unless it comes to a vote and decision, both first by the neighbors and then voted on and discussed and voted on through the Advisory Neighborhood Commission.
Thank you.
Time is up. I had one follow-up question. Ms. Dreisen, you've said a couple times that multifamily generates more trash than single family. Do you mean per unit or do you mean as a sector?
As a sector, per unit, it is very slightly less than single family by household, largely due to the reality that the per capita population per unit for multifamily is slightly lower than single family.
Okay. We've been joined by Commissioner Patience Singleton. If you want to give your testimony, we're not going to do another 10-minute round of questions, but
yeah, I apologize. I have a full-time job and meeting was scheduled this morning at the same time as my intended testimony. So I will give my testimony. I do appreciate you all still being here and giving me the opportunity. So good afternoon, Chairman Mendelson and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before the council regarding this very important legislation. My name is Patience Singleton, and I am the current chair of Advisory Neighborhood Commission 4A and ANC Commissioner for Single Member District 4A04, and an 11-year resident of the Brightwood neighborhood here in Northwest Washington, D.C., which is one of the most socioeconomically, ethnically, and racially diverse neighborhoods in the city. I am testifying in support of Councilmember Louis George's Clean Collections Act amendment of 2022 today on behalf of ANC 4A, which occurs 16,000 residents who live in the neighborhoods of Brightwood, Colonial Village, Crestwood, Northport Estates, Shepherd Park, and 16th Street Heights. On October 6th, ANC 4A voted unanimously to forward a resolution supporting and urging the enactment of the Clean Act to the council and to the mayor. This much needed bill amends the Sustainable Solid Waste Management Amendment Act of 2014 to add specificity to requirements for private collection properties, including one, mandating that the properties provide at least 32 gallons of solid waste container space per residential unit, and contracts with collection services twice per week at a minimum. And three, adds a civil penalty of fines of no less than $500 for repeat violation within a 6-month period. I want to thank Councilmember Louis George for her commitment and responsiveness to the public and safety concerns of residents in my community. There are numerous multifamily properties, including rentals, condominiums, and cooperatives located in ANC 4A, which are not serviced by the DPW. Instead, these properties rely on private collection companies to pick up their trash. Unfortunately, management in these buildings refuse to provide adequate storage for trash, which leads to the accumulation of large amounts of refuse in and around the properties. For example, in Brightwood, there are buildings with 20+ units and more than 50 residents that don't provide dumpsters, or they supply very small ones for residential waste. Instead, the building owners and managers rely on small number of trash cans and recycling cans to store solid waste produced by a large number of multi-family building residents. The residents in these buildings, as you may know, are disproportionately people of color, immigrants, and or have lower incomes. My constituents and others have raised concerns about constantly overflowing trash receptacles at these multifamily buildings in our neighborhood. I routinely witness a trash pile high in cans with no lids, as well as trash falling on the ground around the cans, and that trash is often left on the ground for days. And this results in litter and rodent problems, as others have testified to. When I've contacted government agencies about the public health threat, I've usually been told that the business owners were issued a warning and sometimes small fines, but not much else could be done. The Department of Health has been great at treating neighborhood multifamily properties that surrounds for rodents, but they acknowledge that little can be done to stop the infestation in the neighborhood as long as dumpsters and garbage cans are allowed to overflow on a regular basis. I learned that the inadequate storage and trash collection is tied to current DC law and regulations which do not clearly outline requirements for trash storage and collection, as well as the lax enforcement and the minimal fines and penalties for property owners. That said, I think I'm going over the Clean Collections Act of 2022 will provide much needed clarity and penalties for those failing to provide adequate collections. And it will help keep our community clean. I urge the council to please vote to pass and enact this much needed legislation. If you have any questions for me, please provide them. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. And I'm glad we were able to fit you in. I don't have any questions for you. Councilmember Louis George?
Thank you. No, I don't have any questions. Just thank you so much to Commissioner Patience Singleton for coordinating and working with us on this much needed legislation and for the service she does to her residents of 4A. Thank you.
Thank you.
So that's going to conclude all of your testimony. You all are going to be dismissed. I think you can continue to watch, but I'm going to call the interim director, Michael Carter. So again, thank you very much. Hmm. Director Carter, give us just a minute. I'm waiting for my staff to give me a copy of Mr. Carter's statement, so. Director, when you're ready.
Good afternoon, Chairman Mendelson, members of the Committee of the Whole, and staff. I am Mike Carter, Interim Director of the Department of Public Works, DPW, and I'm joined here today by Reginald May, Interim Deputy Administrator, Solid Waste Management, Susan Burnett, Interim Associate Administrator, Solid Waste Education and Enforcement Program, SWEEP, Blake Adams, Manager, Office of Waste Diversion. I am appearing today before you regarding Bill 24-707, the Containing Litter and Ensuring Adequate Neighborhood Clean Collections Amendment Act of 2022. Bill 24-707, which was introduced by Council members Louis George, Nadeau, Trayon White, Alan Pinto, Robert White, and Bonds Wood, one, require properties which receive collection from private solid waste collectors, for example, multifamily and commercial properties, to provide solid waste containers equivalent to at least 32 gallons of solid waste storage per residential unit at the property. 2, require collectors of solid waste from private collection properties to provide collection services at least twice per week at each such property. And 3, provide for a civil penalty of no less than $500 against private collection property owners and private solid waste collectors for any violations of the provisions of the bill occurring more than once in a 6-month period. Although DPW understands the intent of the bill, and we are supportive in general of efforts to increase the cleanliness and sanitary condition of the city, we have some concerns about the bill as written that I'm happy to share with the committee during today's hearing. Thank you, Chairman Mendelson, and I am prepared to answer any questions that you or the committee may have regarding Bill 24-707. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Carter. I have to say that I haven't had much experience. I haven't had any experience of working with you, but I'm pretty amazed at this testimony. The purpose of this hearing is for you to share your concerns rather than to give us a statement that says you have concerns. So I don't know what the concerns are. Do you want to share them?
For example, Charlotte Drazen had talked about the zero waste plan, and we are rolling it out with the intent of getting more recycling participation from multifamily units, as well as recycling and reduction of contamination in single-family units and multifamily units. Right now, we see this as having a fiscal impact upon our solid waste education and enforcement program. Currently, we have 19 inspectors, and with the ability to enforce this bill would necessitate us submitting an enhancement to at least double our current staff of sanitation inspectors. Our sanitation inspectors, in addition to multifamily units, they also inspect private residential units and also serve to assist doing leaf, snow, and other seasonal programs. Currently, there are close to 5,400 multifamily buildings in the district with a total of over 150,000 units in totality. So we would have to have some additional resources to support and enforce this bill. Additionally, there are concerns about dumpster sizes and whether or not we have the ability to have our trucks navigate through some of the smaller private alleys, as well as for other vehicles, whether or not they're private hauler vehicles, because those private hauler trucks are pretty big. They're the front end loaders, as well as for trucks that do utility work and other deliveries in the district.
Is that it?
Well, I have my solid waste manager, Blake Adams, and I would like them to also share some of their thoughts about how we can better support this bill. But we want to share our concerns so that the bill, when finalized, will be effective to all stakeholders. Also, we can submit a list of our concerns to the committee after the hearing. Blake, could you?
What's the purpose of the hearing if you're going to give us the concerns after the hearing?
Well, we can, provide the written list, but we can give what we have now so that we can support the bill when it's finalized.
Mr. Adams? You're on mute. We can't hear you. I think it might be your earphones.
Or he just needs to select the correct microphone and speaker. I was gonna say the same one.
Or there may be a speaker icon at the bottom of the screen, and you could click there and see if you have the correct option.
Good afternoon, Chairman Mendelson. Can you guys hear me? Thank you. Good afternoon, Chairman Mendelson and Councilmember Louis George, members of the committee. My name is Blake Adams. I'm the manager of the Office of Waste Diversion. I'd like to echo, I think, a lot of what our public witnesses have expressed in terms of their concerns, and maybe start by presenting a couple real life examples of why we're concerned with this legislation as is. As Mr. Harrington pointed out, many residential units in the city, multifamily units, are provided a 96-gallon cart currently. They may receive once a week collection. They may receive twice a week collection. But this legislation would reduce the need for their property to provide 96-gallon. And so if the intent is to increase capacity, 32 gallons twice a week is 64 gallons. That's the minimum. There are many units that require 96 gallons, perhaps twice a week, but at least once. And so even that once a week collection with a 96-gallon provides more than what this legislation would require at the minimum. I also want to point out that the other issue raised by our public witnesses about loading dock space and the impact to the potential impact to large multifamily units. There's not much to differentiate between a recycling cart and a roll-off, or what the container type is per the property type. And so there may be many buildings with 500, 1,000 tenants, large multifamily properties, where they may not be able to comply with these space requirements because of the loading dock size. And lastly, I would agree with Ms. Dreisen's point about, I do believe that the lack of capacity on the recycling side is more of an issue perhaps than on just on the trash or refuse side. And in addition, I would like to share that the Office of Waste Diversion does have the purview and responsibility to identify a uniform make, model, color scheme for both trash and recycling citywide for containers. And part of that is identifying through technical analysis what the right size of those containers should be. 70% or more, as much as 75% of what is disposed of in the refuse stream is recyclable. If you were to work just on that, that figure alone, right sizing containers in the district would mean that a recycling container is two-thirds as large, or I'm sorry, a refuse container would be 1/3 as large as the recycling container. We're still in the process of identifying exactly what those volumes should be. But the main concern is that this would treat all private collection properties, the very large to the very small, with the same minimum requirements. And from our understanding, that this would be potentially problematic, mainly for the property owners to be able to comply. And I'm happy to answer any other questions or the committee might have.
Let me ask Director Carter, are there any other concerns?
Not at this time.
Well, Director Carter, I have to say, this is my own bias. I have a dim view of how the government has been successful with recycling. We've had a recycling requirement in the law for 30 years, and we're only at 25% for residential, single-family residential, and half that for multifamily. That is, I'm sorry, but that's pathetic. I don't see what in this law, this bill, now I'm kind of shifting away from what I just said. I don't see what in this bill requires additional inspectors. I don't have a sense that you use inspectors now to find properties that don't have adequate containers. So why, if we require a minimum size, are you suddenly going to need inspectors?
We do use inspectors to inspect multifamily units. We get complaints, we coordinate and work with DCRA. Mr. Harrington stated that we don't have copies of the plans. We do ask the apartment and condo managers for the solid waste plans. If they don't have them, we'll go to DCRA and get them. And if they don't give them to us, the private condo, we will find it. But we do have inspectors that do multifamily as well as single family.
And they do multifamily on a complaint-based basis.
Yes,
Okay, so that means that rather than the city enforcing its regulation, its existing regulation or law that's been in effect for a long time, rather than the city enforce it, we're relying on private citizens to call, which then may lead to a 311 ticket, which then may lead to an inspector going out, which probably occurs after the violation went away because trash was picked up.
but also we have inspectors that are out on a proactive basis, doing inspections of multifamily units as part of their assignments in that ward. Mr. Reggie May, who headed up sweep for well over 20 years, can relate specifically about the day-to-day activities of a sweep inspector as it relates to inspections of multifamily units.
Your audio kind of got weird. You might want to check that. I'm not getting it. So I said complaint-based, you said, no, you have some proactive. So if there's so much robust enforcement going on, then why are there so many complaints at this hearing about how there's so many multifamily apartments that are violating the law?
Since the pandemic, the number of complaints has risen dramatically. And we have made every attempt with our current staff, and we have been short, and we have hired those additional FTEs. But we do know there will be a fiscal impact where we would have to add more inspectors if we want to put every multifamily unit on a weekly inspection to ensure that this bill is effective.
I'm sorry, where in the bill does it require a weekly inspection on your part? Can you give me the line number or maybe your staff?
Well, I'm saying when we start with this, we want to make sure that we stay on top of it. So my recommendation, and I asked Mr. May and Ms. Burnett to comment, that we will want to have our inspectors go out and stay on top so that there's no non-compliance or significant delays in enforcing this bill.
Well, why don't you have your inspectors get on top of it now? Then we don't even need the bill.
Good afternoon, Councilman. I'm Reginald May, Deputy Administrator for Solid Waste Management Program. And our inspectors are
If somebody's speaking, I can't hear them clearly and I don't know who it is.
We're working to get the camera on.
And Chairman Mendelson, Councilmember Louis George, as we're waiting for Mr. May to his audio, I would like to share some positive news, I think, about DPW's future efforts this fiscal year to staff up for multifamily enforcement. So the Office of Waste Diversion will be actually hiring 8 employees within our office to work alongside sweep inspectors, and their focus is going to be specifically on multifamily inspection and compliance with respect to recycling. This is funded in this FY23 budget, and the requirement was included in the Zero Waste Omnibus Amendment Act. So the Office of Waste Diversion, Department of Public Works, in collaboration with SWEEP, will be staffing up this year for more inspection broader across the city for multifamily. But I'll defer to Mr. May about ongoing efforts.
Good afternoon, Councilmember Mendelson, Councilmember George. Our sweep inspectors are out every day being proactive with regards to the storage and collection of solid waste and recycling. We routinely check single-family homes and commercial properties for compliance. In those instances where we find that they're not in compliance, we do issue citations. We are also in contact with property owners or their managers, expressing our concerns about whether or not there's sufficient storage and collection containers on the property. We can advise those managers or property owners about adding additional containers or a larger dumpster, but we do not have the ability to enforce them, to force them to get it. What we do when we can't get compliance is move into the issuance of citations. It was earlier stated that enforcement is spotty, to say the least. That's not correct. We enforce on a routine basis. What happens is it then becomes the responsibility of the property owner to come into compliance. Fines don't necessarily equate to change. There has to be a will on the part of the property owner to do that.
Okay, so you're saying the fines are of no effect, even though my experience is that people don't like fines and that they have some effect. But before I go there, so if you are out there inspecting all of the properties, why is it that the director is saying you're going to need to double the number of inspectors?
As the city grows and more people move into the city, more houses are being built, more apartment buildings are going up. It's almost at this point in some wards, and I'll ask Ms. Burnett to jump in here if necessary. The number of inspectors per ward needs to, as the volume of our residents increase, the number of inspectors per ward will also need to increase to keep up compliance.
But that has nothing to do with this bill. And the director said that this bill will require double the number of inspectors. But I will note that in 2019, we estimated our population at 710 or 715,000 residents. And in the census, our population was found to be about 689,000 residents. So I'm having a little bit of difficulty with the as the city grows argument.
So when I came into the Department of Public Works 20 years ago, there were more than 30 sweep inspectors and recycling and a separate office of recycling managing the storage and collection part of Public Works, enforcement end of it. Today, as the director said, there are 19 inspectors and no recycling inspectors. And so, well,
Well, that sounds like that's a fundamental problem to the agency that has nothing to do with the bill. And I'm reasonably certain that last spring, when the director testified, which may not have been Mr. Carter, he said that or she, whoever said that the budget was adequate. Have you put in for a budget enhancement request for 2024 for doubling the number of inspectors, Mr. Carter?
Chairman, so we'll put in an enhancement. I can't say if exactly double, but we know we will need more inspectors because in some wards, there's only 2 to 3 inspectors, and we may need to go to 3 to 4 to 5, depending upon the population in those respective wards.
The population, even if the population isn't changing.
But we see more multifamily units being built every day in the district. So we'll have to go out and do our count. Sometimes the population numbers are behind, but we will submit an enhancement. We just don't know the exact number, but we will need more people. It may not be double, but we will need more inspectors in the 8 wards.
All right, so help me here. The chair of ANC 4A said, unfortunately, management in many of these buildings in her ANC refused to provide adequate storage for trash, which leads to the accumulation of large amounts of refuse in and around the properties. For example, in Brightwood, there are buildings with 20 plus units and more than 50 residents that don't provide dumpsters for residential waste. Instead, the building owners' management rely on a small number of trash and recycling cans to store solid waste produced by a large number of residents. So if you're proactively inspecting, why is the chair of an ANC complaining?
So I'll, once again, council member, I'm sorry. While we have the ability to issue citations to property owners to suggest to them that they need larger containers, more collection days, we do not have the ability to make it happen. We can't say, do this or do this or do this. What we can do, and we do, is to issue citations. And commercial citations begin at $150 for the first one. The second one within the 60 days becomes $300, and then $600, and then $1,200, and on and on and on. But unless—
How on and on and on is that?
So we can get up to $2,000 per day, but that does not necessarily equate to the property owner changing their behavior. And that's where the issue is.
Why not? If you hit me with $150 fine, I might ignore it. You start hitting me with a $2,000 fine per day, I'm not sure I'm going to ignore it.
Well,
but maybe you're not sending your inspectors out.
Most responsible people don't ignore those things. But if they don't have trash collectors, it shows that they're not really interested in maintaining those buildings. Someone said that earlier on today, that some of these property owners are not taking very good care of their buildings.
Okay, so Director Carter, where are the proposals from your agency on how to deal with these problems? Or has your agency been exploring strategies like working with the Attorney General to bring suit against these properties? What's happening besides just accepting this problem and throwing up your hands?
We are working with DCRA and other agencies to try to get these owners to come into compliance.
And I didn't see that in the director's statement, but also where's the evidence that something's different?
I'm not clear on what it is that you're asking.
Well, I'm reasonably certain that at the last oversight hearing by the Committee on Transportation and the Environment, that the department said we are working with DCRA to improve compliance.
So
So what's different?
We have a weekly, well, bi-weekly meeting with DCRA, and we have worked with them and they work with us on those problematic private properties and also multifamily unit properties that need to be abated. We have been working with our own staff to develop a strategy to deal with those properties, and we'll make those recommendations that do not become compliant immediately. But we have to work through, well, formerly DCRA, but now the Department of Buildings, to make folks be compliant more quickly as opposed to paying a fine, which is considered the cost of doing business.
Well, you just said that you can't force a property owner to comply with the law. And now you're saying, well, actually, you're in weekly meetings with DCRA to force the property owner to comply.
No, we're in bi-weekly meetings. When those properties are not compliant, we go out and take action with DCRA taking the lead. Now, if we have to get either place the containers there or make a decision that they have to do it right away, we need DCRA's assistance. Right now, we are just basically finding and abating and asking them to do the right thing.
I'm reasonably certain that you're not going out within, what is it, the fine doubles within 6 months or 6 weeks, Mr. May?
So our fines can double within 24 hours. We don't generally issue a second citation within 24 hours. It's usually, we do a reinspection in 72 hours. And if the property owner has not come into compliance, then we'll issue another citation and we begin to work with our agency partners to try to get the building owner to come into compliance.
Okay, I'm going to guess that these buildings that are serial violators, that you're not coming out within that period of time to issue the second fine. Because that certainly sounds to me like a strategy that'll get them to come into compliance.
As I indicated earlier, that our inspectors, I may not have, but I should have routine footprints. And so the inspector will know which serial violators are not in compliance, and we do take action. And then we do reach out to DCRA and the Department of Health, the rat abatement control unit, to try to get some compliance from these property owners.
Okay, so you're testifying that there are a number of apartment buildings that have tens of thousands of dollars in solid waste fines.
I'm saying that there are apartment buildings that have thousands of dollars in fines.
And
Yes,
I
sir.
said tens of thousands.
Yes, sir, that's correct, sir.
Tens of thousands, because if it goes from 150 to 300 to 600 to 1,200 to 2,000 per day, and the testimony from the ANC commissioner and from Ms. Patterson was that there are properties where this is constantly a problem, then they should have tens of thousands of dollars in fines. If you're going out there and re-inspecting promptly.
So I will attest to thousands of dollars in fines. I still tens of thousands of dollars. I can't say, but I'm happy to do research and to get back to you.
I want to say don't bother because I'm not sure you're going to find anything. But if it's per occurrence, and I, as a property owner, work my way up to $2,000 within a matter of a week or two, all you have to do is keep coming out every week after that, and you'll get another 2,000. 5 weeks, you got 10,000. Am I misunderstanding?
No, you're absolutely correct.
And then I want to ask the question of the director, how many of these fines are actually paid? If it helps, I'll tell you that DCRA's answer in the past has been they don't know.
We, Mr. May and Ms. Burnett, they keep the number of cases we send down to OAH and the number of fines that are paid. I don't have that with me now, but we can get that to you by close of business on Monday, but we do track that statistic.
Councilmember Lewis George.
Thank you, Chairman. I have some questions, and I'm not sure, Director Carter or Mr. May, if you're best to answer, but I think I'll ask you, Mr. May. How do sweep inspectors currently determine if a property is providing adequate solid waste containers, right? One of the issues, if you're enforcing something, is that in order for a person to know to come into compliance, they would have to know what they need to, how they need to come into compliance. But right now, the term we use simply is just that they shall provide adequate waste collection, and that's it. So how do you define adequate waste collection? And then how do you monitor compliance of a requirement that's vague as such that just says adequate?
So it's been what we do, what our inspectors do, is to, depending on the size of the commercial unit, 4 units or more, we'll meet with the property manager where there's constant overflow. We'll meet with the property manager or owner and say, look, what you have is a 20-unit building. 3 toters for trash, 2 toters for recycling is not sufficient, even if you have twice a week collection. What you need is a dumpster or 2 rather than the toters, and a minimum of twice a week collection. And if that works out, then we're in compliance. If not, then we'll go back and say to the property owner, even though you've made these changes, what you need is to think about adding additional collection dates. And we do know that there are some large buildings in the city who have come into compliance by adding toters where there were dumpsters and having more collection dates. And that generally will resolve the problem. The inspector will continue to monitor to make sure that the compliance stays in effect. And if that's the case, then all is well. If not, then we go back to the manager or the property owner and say, you're not in compliance, come into compliance, or we begin to issue citations again.
Okay, so let me ask you this. So basically, when you say someone has, you determine, the inspector in the office determines what adequate is for every building in the city. You sort of piecemeal determine what's adequate. There's no set sort of adequate, there's no set number for adequate. So you just determine by looking at the size of the building, the unit, and individually just giving different answers for what's adequate.
We do know that twice a week collection is required for private outlets.
I know I'm going to get to the frequency, but right now I want to get to the size, right?
Right.
So how do you say to someone, you need to have adequate trash collection? How do you define adequate to all of our multifamily units? Right now, the words are just adequate.
Right.
What is adequate, and how do they know what adequate is if it's not defined?
So again, what we do is look at what's there. And if what's there isn't doing what it was supposed to do, which is storing solid waste properly, holding solid waste with the lid down tight so that rodents can't get in, etc., then the request is made to go from trash containers to a dumpster, 4-yard, 8-yard, to hold the trash.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
there.
Okay. So if I have this trash can and this is the trash can behind an apartment building, and one of your sweep inspectors goes and says, how are you training your sweep inspectors to say this is adequate or this is not adequate? What are you giving them for the definition of adequate, whether they see trash outside of it or not?
So whether there's whether the lid is closed, the lid is closed on the container is full and the lid is closed. If there is trash and debris around the container or containers, then we know that that may not be sufficient to contain all of the trash from this property. And so our inspectors are to call the manager or property owner to meet with them at the site or to meet with them in their office and to say, we've been monitoring your property. This is what we've observed. You need a larger container to house your trash and recycling in. And we will, and generally ask that it's done in a week or so.
Okay, so again, that means it's all based on sort of the observations of a sweep inspector,
That's correct.
right?
That's correct.
And then a meeting is established, and you would have to do that if the district, how many multifamily housing units does the district currently have?
I believe the 5,200 plus.
So we would have to, if based on that number, you would have to individually do that for every single one of them by not having adequate defined in the statute currently. That leads you to have to do this individually for every single multifamily unit.
That's correct. For every multi-family unit that does not meet compliance standards right now.
Okay. So that makes your job, not having it defined, actually makes your job harder, not easier.
It could.
And over time, you've been in this work for a while. So over time, I'm sure there are people in DPW like yourself who are professionals, right? Who could probably tell us, right, what usually is an adequate size trash can for certain units, right? Like you could say, hey, I've been around the block. I know a unit building a 20 plus or such. You're going to probably need like 3 of those, council member, if they're going to actually adequately, keep trash. You would probably know that.
It depends on location, yes.
Okay. So so I think this is one of those things where in helping you help the community, what I'm trying to get at is we have to define adequate, or you are going to need more sweep inspectors because you're going to do this piece by piece, multi-housing unit by multi-housing unit, when there's probably best practice sizes that we could put into statute so that every multi-housing unit manager can't say they don't know what adequate means.
I think that could be right if you could get the owners of those multifamily buildings to buy in.
Okay. When we do the notices, right? So you do notices each time one of them, you get it, what's it called? The notice of violation.
Violation, yes, ma'am.
All right. What goes on that notice of violation? What do you put on the notice of violation?
Well, it depends on what the inspector finds at the property being inspected or the property in question.
Okay. Does it include how they are is curing the issue on the notice of violation simply pick up the trash? That's the only sort of thing that's in the notice of violation? How you cure this is by just picking up the trash?
Not necessarily. It could read, they're insufficient, and we have a violation for this called insufficient number of containers.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
And so what the inspector would do is say, this property needs additional containers or a dumpster. And I'm going to ask Ms. Burnett, who was actually the interim administrator for SWEEP, to speak more on this. She's probably better at this than I am. So I'm going to just pass you to her.
Hello.
Hello. Hey, Ms. Burnett, how you doing?
Hi, good, thanks. Yeah, it depends. A building
Uh-oh, you went out. If you are speaking, I cannot hear you.
Yeah, we're working on the camera.
Okay. While we're waiting, can someone share with me the number of notice of violations that are issued for inadequate number of containers?
We don't have that now, but we could share our fiscal 22 activities with data and fines with you early part of next week, and maybe going back 2 or 3 years pre-COVID and during COVID.
Okay.
But we have that data.
Okay, I think I hear Ms. Burnett coming. I don't know.
We're gonna move on to another PC. Hold on.
Okay. All right, Mr. Blake, while we're waiting, Mr. Adams, sorry. While we're waiting, can I ask you, why doesn't DPW collect recycling plans from multifamily buildings?
Well, we're about to. So the funding for the staff to support the requirement for multifamily buildings to submit source separation plans has been provided in this fiscal year. And we've already submitted to DCHR the position descriptions for those employees who will be out and about, again, working hand in hand with SWEEP, mostly on the education and outreach side, as we pointed out, informing properties of the requirements is almost as important as actually responding after the fact. And so we will be likely hiring those employees in the early calendar year of 2023. And at that time, we will open up our, we'll create an online platform which will allow properties and property managers to submit their source separation plans, which will give the agency just another set of information when we do conduct compliance.
Okay, got it. Thank you, I appreciate that. Ms. Burnett, you with us now?
Hello. Hi,
Hello,
I'm
thank
there.
you.
Hi, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
With respect to container size, it is a challenge. Each building's footprint may have a different layout. A 200 unit building in one section of the city may have a completely different trajectory for access to those containers as the same building in another footprint. So it's very hard to make the definitive size that would be required. So yes, we do this now visually, and it's not the best thing, but right now it's the best that we have to make a determination for those buildings that don't comply and don't come into compliance. With respect to fines, yes, we issue the fines when we don't find buildings coming into compliance. Fines don't necessarily bring people into compliance, but it does help. And it is our enforcement arm that works the best. We do issue educational material as well as warnings, but fines are the most effective way to try to bring about compliance. Of course, we can issue fines, but the court may say, we hear you, we see, but we're going to reduce those fines. So all fines that are issued are not necessarily paid as they are issued. Another thing is fines can also be issued, but they may not be paid even though they are found guilty. They will become a lien, and then an individual or organization may address those fines when it comes time to either sell or refinance a property. Those fines will carry liens. We can get the amount of the fines that we have issued, and we may be able to work with our finance office to get the information as to what's been collected on those fines.
Okay. I appreciate that. And I think one thing you said is, you know, the one thing is the enforcement piece of this. And I think the enforcement piece is a big piece here. But one of the focuses I'm focusing on with this legislation is defining what coming into compliance means, because it actually would make your job easier if we sort of broke it down and said, hey, units 4 to 20 units, we know from our past, from the work we've done, that this is at least the minimum amount of trash cans and the gallons you need to have for a building your size, right? The same if someone has 101 units over time. So the thought is to not make this language that says adequate, because when you use vague language, it means that you can't really blame someone for being in compliance, because they're going to say, well, I don't know what compliance is, because all I was told was it just needs to be adequate. And then that leaves you to all have to define adequate each and every separate time for each and every individual multifamily building, which, like the director just said, we have new multifamily building units coming up every day. So I'm trying to get to a space where we can define, right? The purpose of the legislation is define what adequate means for multifamily units based on what you know as the experts here, right? On what certain units should have or need to make sure that we can say, like, all right, you shouldn't be a building with 20, you know, with 100 units and have little mini trash cans like that, right? Like, that's common sense, but compliance wise says, what I mean is you need to have this size gallon with a lid with this material in order for it to be adequate. So I'm trying to get to that piece too, of what is considered adequate and how we're doing it. And it sounds like right now we don't have an exact definition. We're sort of basing it each and every time separately by visually, and that also hurts the sweep inspectors because they like kind of each and every time have to make these discretionary calls that could be defined easier for them. Frequency, that's the other piece, right? So one thing we hear from our ANC commissioners is the size, right? They don't have they're not having adequate amount of solid waste. The other piece is, okay, I heard the director say earlier, hey, one of the issues might be that we might have with this is, you know, the dock size. Well, if we come to an issue where it's a dock size issue, right? That means maybe they have to keep the same size trashes, but their frequency might have to improve, right? Because frequency is an issue. Right now, how are we now enforcing the frequency piece of this? Like how are we monitoring whether trash is being picked up sufficiently? Like how are we defining that? Because that's another area where we sort of don't have definition.
Well, it's required. Hello?
Yep.
Are you hearing me? Okay, yeah. It's required that buildings that require private collection, which are multifamily residential buildings of 4 units or more, are required to have a minimum of 2 collections per week. Some have more. When we come across buildings that do not, that are not in compliance, we move to work with those buildings to bring about compliance through fines, right? I find that most of the buildings do have twice a week collection, but lately there's been a problem with certain private haulers that have become in breach of contract with the owners of the property. So the owners of the property are trying to keep the compliance, but because their haulers have fallen out of compliance because of whatever is going on with the hauling contracts across the city, in the region, really.
Okay.
And that's something going on with some of the private haulers. We're seeing that.
Okay. So 2 things, because thank you, you gave me 2 great information here. So one, what I'm hearing is I'm not hearing, how do we know that they're doing a 2-week collection? We sort of rely on the building managers reporting to us that they didn't collect twice a week, or is this one of the areas where the sweep inspectors have to do we know the days of the week in which each of these private companies are supposed to pick up from the buildings?
It's in the hauler contract, and we can get a copy of the hauler contract. We typically review the hauler contracts. The sweep inspectors do that as part of their routine building inspection when they're in their footprints. So they are familiar. Typically it's when an individual may call and say there's something going on and trash is not being collected the way it typically was or the way it typically is, because pretty much I think everyone knows the twice a week collection is required in their buildings. That's kind of common knowledge.
Okay.
And it's by law as well.
So what I'm hearing is the sweep inspectors have sort of their footprint, and they know sort of the hauling days for each of the buildings within their footprint. And if, you know, they ride past one of our place that they know is supposed to pick up trash on Tuesday, and they see the trash still there on Wednesday, they can basically issue a fine because they know that the trash wasn't picked up.
And also we try
Am I
to take
interpreting that right?
Yes. And we try to take it a step further, right? Even though we issue a fine, a lot of times we try to get into it a little deeper where we reach out to the building management, but we also try to reach out to the hauler themselves to try to understand, okay, what is stopping you from doing this? You know, what's going on? Sometimes it's, you know, non-payment. So then the hauler says, hey, building owner hasn't paid me. I'm not picking up until I get a check. So that's part of some of the issues that are these contractual issues that are behind the issue of the pickup.
Got it. Okay. And so your job and you all's role when we have those issues is to communicate between the hauler and the building manager. Are you sort of that intermediary?
We try to, because, you know, you're trying to help a tenant or a resident of a building. So you're trying to dig a little deeper than just slap a fine on people. You're really trying to understand, well, what's behind this? Because it's typically where something's changed. They were getting regular twice a week pickup, twice a week or more, and then something happened where pickup sort of stopped, or there's been sort of a change in the pickup. And then that's where we try to get involved and dig a little deeper into what's going on.
Okay. So it looks like right now we were talking about whether you all are doing proactive sort of engagement on this issue or whether it's sort of reactive to 311 complaints. What's the process after receiving a complaint? You all get the complaint from 311, I'm guessing. That's how it works? And then you all from that 311 complaint?
We get 311 complaints, we get Twitter feeds, we get residents, we get ANCs, we get council member offices. We try to address them as they come in. We prefer people use the 311 system so that we can have a real tracked record of the complaint and the follow-up, but we do address it however they come in.
Okay. And then I think Mr. May was talking about when you all are, I guess, telling someone to come in compliance. I was trying to get a sense of what is included on the compliance, what's included on that notice of infraction.
Right. It's typically what Reggie was saying. You know, we spew the code. We put the information regarding the fine that's due. If it's a ticketed fine. We let them know, your containers you don't have enough containers, or your containers are not adequate. But you're right. There is no definitive number where we say you have 2 containers and you need to have 4. We work with the buildings because you're working with the building and you're working with the footprint that the property is in as to the size. We've also had issues where the size of the containers has affected the parking of the building. And then we get complaints about, well, they have the containers, but I can't get out because the containers block my parking. So the footprint of the building also has to be considered when you're talking about coming up with a number that makes sense.
Okay.
A 100 unit building in one section of the city has a very different footprint than a 100 unit building in another section of the city. And it's very hard to just say, boom, that's the number for a 100 unit building. We try to work with people.
we could give a minimum though. We could say at the very least, we know based on our experience, 100-unit building should have at the very least, this size container. If they, you know, like, we can do that. Or we can say, we know that you need this many collections based on the history of what we know in our experience.
Collections, yes.
Okay.
I'm still kind of, container size is, it's just, you've got to be looking at the footprint, the architectural landscape of the building and what they can actually hold and what that layout looks like in conjunction with everything that's going on around that. We do site assessments all the time when there's renovation projects, when things are happening, and how is that going to impact collections, private collection, DPW collection.
Right.
It just depends on the footprint of that building and what's happening in that location.
Okay. Now, and when I ask you, because you all are the experts in this, and the goal of this is to make your inspector's job easier and your job easier, right? People can't come into compliance. They don't know what compliance is. Inspectors can't enforce. They don't know what the threshold is. What about the material of it? Because sometimes we hear from neighbors like, oh, the rats can chew through certain types of trash cans or certain materials, right? Or that's what we've heard. We heard some of the trash cans, people can chew through them. I heard Mr. May say, you know, they need to have a top on top of them, right? And then you got these big ones like this. Sometimes they have a top, but then they have this here. What about material? Are there any requirements we have right now for like the material, the materials that the trash can must be made of to ensure, so we can ensure like we don't have rodent infestation, but also that we can contain the trash so it doesn't have all of this, you know, people putting trash all around different trash cans. What about that?
I might have to kick that off to somebody with respect to what the containers are made of.
Like what they're made of and what they're required to have. What requirements are supposed to be a part of them?
You definitely have to have a secured lid. So all trash must be containerized. Containerized meaning a tight fitting lid where no trash or debris can be outside, no rodents can come in. But we know, as you say, rodents do chew through some of the material that we currently use for containers. So we know that that's not always foolproof.
Right. So that's another area where I think we can make some adjustments and make it clear so that our multifamily unit can have the not only the material that can sort of back away from the rodents, but also that has an adequate, you know, adequate amount there. The other question I have is sort of now, do you all work with DC Health to respond to the rat infestation? So if they cite someone for too many rats, do they ever refer the properties to you for inadequate solid waste collections?
Typically, it's the reverse. When we find that there's inadequate solid waste or excessive trash and debris or uncontainerized containers, we reach out to the Department of Health. We have a great working relationship with them. They're very responsive and they address rat abatement concerns very quickly.
Okay, I would agree. DC Health does respond very, very quickly in that respect. I just wanted to get a sense of you all sort of conversations around this. Now, let me ask you this. Would you say many properties right now, many of our multi-family building currently provide less than 32 gallons of solid waste space per residential unit?
I'm really not sure. I'm going to have to kick that off maybe to my colleagues on that. I'm really not sure.
Where's Mr. May? I know he got the experience.
I'm kicking off to Reggie.
Reggie got the years in the game.
Oh no.
And I'm happy to respond as well. I think that I think you can, you know, make some assumptions that there are some properties with potentially 1,000 residents or 1,000 units. I mean, I think these would be very large in the city. But if you were to say that there's a minimum requirement of 32 gallons, 32 gallons times 1,000 would be 32,000 gallons. That would be larger than the standard roll-off dumpster size. And so that building to comply might have to provide 2. And the space just in their loading dock just might not, allow for that. But I'd also like to echo, I think what Susan pointed out is the importance of the hauler building relationship. And when our office of waste diversion, because we do get complaints from multifamily residents about timely collection issues at their buildings, it most often has to do with the hauler relationship. And what we typically advise those property owners to do is to review our multifamily toolkit, which we released in 2021, which really documents and provides information about what the requirements are. But we do simply tell property owners to, if they're having problems with their hauler, to find another hauler. That in this free market system, they have the ability to go out and find another business to work with if they're not getting timely collection. So I do think that there's a very important piece of this hauler multifamily building property manager relationship that should be addressed as well.
I hear you. I hear you on the 100 units. When we did some of the numbers, it looks like less than 7% of buildings are over 100 units, right? So that's 361 of like the 5,385 multi-buildings and building units in the city. Most of the newer buildings also being that under that 100 units. So we're talking about a small subset that are that 100 units. But I still think that the 32 gallons of solid waste storage per residential unit for them is still what is necessary for us to address this issue. What else can we do to make sure haulers are doing a good job other than to just tell people to hire someone else?
Well, right now, what the agency is working on is our zero waste DC plan. And part of what's in our proposed plan is to conduct an overhaul of the solid waste code to assess, regulations across the board. And I think really we do intend to seek stricter requirements for the hauling community because there is a lot of ambiguity in the regs currently about it's the responsibility of the building to provide timely collection, but the hauler is the one who's providing it. And so if a private business, a company does not provide that, then the private collection property is in compliance. And that's something we hear a lot from multifamily property managers and something that we're hoping to correct. Perhaps if we correct that, then that might allow for a better relationship across the city.
Okay. All right. Thank you. I think we've gotten to the place where, Chairman, I guess you all can't say it. I think we agree. So that we need to define these things and it would be easier on inspectors. It would be easier for your agency if we had a definition for what was adequate, what's adequate waste collection. And if we had a real compliance number and we put those things in action. And I think we all agree that the inadequate solid waste containers can lead to rat infestations and potential misuse of our public litter cans. So I think, I don't see any real opposition here. That's all I'm saying. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Councilmember. I have a follow-up question. What is the capacity of a standard roll-off?
Chairman Mendelson, my apologies. At this time, I can't give you the answer to that question, but I'm happy to do the research and get back to you on it.
Okay, I'm following up on Mr. Adams saying that he-
Yes, I too don't have the exact number, but I remember doing that calculation prior as I think it's gallons or cubic yards are usually the standard metric, and that's the number that I have in my head. I'm not quite sure to convert that to gallons at this time, but we'd be happy to follow up with the exact figure.
do you know what the cubic foot volume is for a standard roll-off?
I believe it's between 20 and 30 cubic yards. There are many sizes and, big, small to conform to different space constraints.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to conclude this hearing. This has been a hearing on Bill 24-707 containing litter and ensuring adequate neighborhood Collections Amendment Act, or the Clean Collections Amendment Act. I want to thank everybody for their testimony. The record is open for 2 weeks. That is, it will close at 5 o'clock on Friday, November 4th. The time is 5:40 p.m. and this hearing is adjourned.